This is Title 18, Word Crimes. I'm Eric Arneson. This episode was recorded live at a Noir at the Bar event in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the night before the NoirCon convention opened. NoirCon takes place every 2 years, always in Philly. It is a superb convention, and you should think about joining us there in 2016. Start planning now. For this Noir at the Bar, 12 authors read their work at the Misconduct Tavern in Philadelphia. Here on the Word Crimes podcast, I'm dividing the event into 3 parts. This is part 2, with readings by Mary Jones, Don Lafferty, Sarah Weinman, and Dennis Tafoya. If you missed part number 1, that's episode 18 of the podcast. You can find it on my website, on iTunes, on Stitcher, wherever you download your podcasts. A special thanks to our MC, Peter Rozovsky, who writes about international crime fiction at his blog, Detectives Beyond Borders. I couldn't possibly introduce the authors any better than Peter does, so let's get right to it. This is Noir at the Bar, Philadelphia.
Mary Jones is the author of 5 Harper Jennings thrillers, 2 L. Harrison mystery suspense novels, 4 Zoe Hayes mysteries, and a bunch of nonfiction humor books. She will read to us from In the Woods, a light, dark thriller due out in February.
Al Rogers unzipped his tent just before sunrise. The air was chill and smelled like dead leaves. Nothing moved. It was too early or too late. That time when night creatures found their dens and day creatures hadn't begun to stir. That time when nothing ever happened. Still, Al hesitated before going out. He hadn't slept much. Kinsella had kept him up, calling him on the radio, whispering that some beast was outside his tent. Al had checked and seen nothing. But every time he'd fallen asleep, boom, Kinsella had radioed again. "Did you hear it?" he'd asked. "All I hear is you, Kinsella. Go the fuck to sleep." "Listen, wait, did you hear that?" Al had listened, had heard something that sounded like an owl. "It's a hoot owl." No, not that. I mean the creeping and thumping. Something heavy and big. I swear it's the Bogman. Get a grip, Kinsella. There is no such thing as a Bogman. He's like the boogeyman. He doesn't exist. If you're hearing anything, it's an animal looking for food. "I'm not goofing around, Al." When he was nervous, Jim's voice rose in pitch. It had become high falsetto. "Don't tell me it's a bear or a fox. It's not. It's something heavy and huge. Jesus, it's outside. I hear it. It's right outside my tent." His voice was tight, soprano. Once again, cursing, Al had opened his tent and peered out. Once again, he'd seen no one. Nothing but the woods, the sky, and the curving hulk of Kinsella's tent. "You ought to know better," he scolded Kinsella. "You've been walking the pipeline, 2 years? By now you should be used to it. If you spend too much time out here, you start to imagine things. You got to ignore it. Take charge of your mind." "I'm not imagining." "Look, Kinsella, I don't know what the fuck you've been smoking, but you're fine. Relax. I'm going to sleep." He'd promised that if Jim called again, he'd suffer a fate worse than any Bogman could bring on. So Kinsella had stopped calling and apparently fallen asleep. His tent was closed up tight. Good. Al would have some time to himself before Jim got up. Not that Jim was a bad guy, just that Al was better alone. Companionship that lasted more than an hour or 2 intruded on him, wore him out, and he and Jim had been together nonstop for weeks. Well, only 8 more days. Then he'd have 7 days off. No miles to walk, no pipeline to inspect, nobody around him 24/7. He'd hole up in his condo, take long hot showers, sleep on an actual bed, order pizzas, drink beer, stare at the tube, maybe call Miranda. Maybe not. The morning was brisk, dewy. Al crawled out of his tent and looked around. checking the campsite. Not that he believed for 1 second that an abominable bog creature had been lurking in the mist, or that indentations in the dirt were monstrous footprints. No, that was crap, all of it. Above him, birds began twittering. Al took a deep breath and stepped away from the camp, following a narrow path. He loved the stillness, the crunch of footsteps on fallen leaves, the sense of being where nobody could bother him. And these woods fit him like a coat, snug and close. But up ahead he saw a burst of light, as if the woods were coming to an end. Now how could that be? According to the pipeline charts, the forest continued for miles. Al kept going and came to a small open field, maybe an acre. He stopped at the tree line, gazing across. The grass stirred. A startled rabbit darted away. The sky was brightening, Al's stomach rumbling. Time to head back, make coffee, wake up Jim, and start the day. Al stopped beside a tree to take a leak. At first, he thought the sound was his piss hitting the ground, but then he noticed it was getting louder and coming from behind as if someone was rustling the foliage coming up the path. Shit, had to be Jim. Couldn't the guy leave him alone for a fucking half hour? He looked over his shoulder to tell Jim to back the hell off. But the figure moving through the trees wasn't Jim. In fact, it wasn't even human. Al stiffened. Was it a bear? No, not a bear. Bigger. And it was stomping, lifting its knees like a damn drum major. Shit, what the fuck was it? Al peered through the branches and watched in disbelief. It was coming toward him, covered head to toe with fur. And oh shit, it had fangs. He didn't stick around to see more. Al whirled, his wrist scraping a broken branch as he tore ahead. Twigs scratched his face, snagged his shirt, but he didn't dare slow down or look around. He just ran, zigzagging, not sure in which direction he was heading, hopping over rocks, skipping over puddles, his heart flipping, breath raging. Finally, panting, he stopped behind a fat oak and peered around. Saw nothing. No hairy, fanged creature. Even so, he couldn't stop shaking, couldn't catch his breath. What the fuck had just happened? Had he actually seen the bogman? Had Jim been right about it stomping around their campsite? Nah, it couldn't be. The bogman wasn't real. It was bullshit, just a Yeti or a Bigfoot story. But what he'd seen had been real, big and hairy and marching down the path. Al's teeth were chattering. Christ, he'd somehow gouged his wrist. Blood streamed all over his sleeve and hand. He pressed on the wound. He'd have to clean it up when he got back to camp. But where was camp? He looked around trying to orient himself. Nothing looked familiar. Okay, he'd just go back to the clearing and find the path again, as soon as his legs would support him. Still shaky, Al doubled back toward the clearing, his mind on the creature. He moved quietly, cautiously. When a twig crackled somewhere, he jumped. When a squirrel darted in front of him, he froze. When he finally got to the clearing, the sun was peering over the treetops, full-out morning. He scanned the perimeter for the path. Maybe the thing had left footprints. He could call the forest ranger and have him come out. They'd track it and catch it, figure out what the hell it was. He walked along the edge of the field looking for the path, picturing fangs, not noticing a person in the trees behind him, aiming a rifle at his back. Before the bullet shattered his ribs and ripped through his right ventricle, Al had 3 final thoughts. The first was if they captured the creature, he'd be famous and the press would hound him. The second was that he shouldn't have ventured out into the woods alone without his rifle. And the third was, oh damn, with all that running around, he'd forgotten to zip his fly.
Thanks. I've heard Mary read a few times, and I always think that it's too bad she missed the golden age of radio. I love hearing her read.
Missed it by a lot.
Missed it by many, many decades. Don Lafferty's short fiction has appeared in Needle Magazine, Crime Factory, and Shotgun Honey. He's written corporate communications, advertising and marketing copy, and feature articles. He's a member of the Liars Club, several of them are here, the social media director of the Wild River Review, and he's on the board of the Philadelphia Writers Conference. Don Lafferty.
I can only hope everybody feels half as good as I do tonight. This is bullshit, said Wang. I'm a degreed engineer. We all are. He motioned to his colleagues seated at the conference table, and all three glared at Rosso with the kind of absolute disdain that only the very truly downtrodden can pull off without any irony. Rosso, senior vice president of operations, aimed her French manicured pointer finger at Wang and swept it across to include the other two Chinese. You are employees of this company, she said, pausing to make eye contact with each, and if I tell you to be actors for 5 goddamn minutes, that's what you're going to fucking do. She was right. This was Zhuhai, China, not Silicon Valley. And while these engineers were indeed educated men, HR policies offered no protection in the cesspool of corruption that was China's Industrial Revolution. The three men left the conference room with downcast eyes, and Rosso turned to me. I shook my head in disbelief. Tonight I'll show you how to lock down a customer for life, she smiled. Watch and learn, rookie. You're in China now. Was I ever. My first trip to our South China factory and the single most important piece of business I'd ever done in my career. Joel Kravitz, the head of purchasing for IBM, and his team of qualification gurus were coming to do an on-site visit of my company's factory. Their thumbs up or thumbs down meant the difference between public and private school for my kids. Toyotas or Beamers for Karen and me, and vacations at the shore or Bali. With an approval from this team, I'd springboard to VP within a year and maybe even be president of one of our business units before the age of 40. We were waiting for them at the ferry terminal when they came in from Hong Kong later that evening. Why the hell aren't we going to Macau? Asked Kravitz. I came all this way. I expect to see more than this shithole and another freaking factory. Don't worry, answered Rosso. Tomorrow night we'll celebrate our business in style. Tonight we do downtown Zhuhai. We stepped out of the ferry station into the sweltering Guangdong night. What the fuck is all that noise? Asked Kravitz, his voice raised to overcome the din of buzzing insects, chirping amphibians, and jungle birds all around. Welcome to the People's Republic of China, Rosso yelled. The van driver navigated the surreal landscape of the tropical jungle, abandoned housing developments, and gray concrete buildings to the Holiday Inn Zhuhai. Yes, there's a Holiday fucking Inn in Zhuhai, China. A real coup for them, too, because even though every accommodation in the hotel comes from the neighborhood, the familiarity of that Holiday Inn logo gives Westerners some semblance of normalcy, even though it's constantly being swept away by everything around. Nothing in this part of China is normal. As the drinks flowed and the night marched on, I was finally back in my element, across the table from my customer, just being me, getting it done, when one of the IBMers leaned in close. How does it work around here exactly? He asked. What's that? I replied. The girls, he said. Do they speak English? As if she was reading his lips from the far end of the table, Rosso flashed her smile and waved the head waiter to our table. Gentlemen, he announced, giving everyone at the table a moment to pay attention. We have a very special party awaiting you. He motioned to a curtain next to the stage, where Filipino twins impeccably covered every Western female singer I'd ever heard. And Michael Jackson. And Rosso pressed a Chris Benjamin into his hand and helped her from her chair. A very special party indeed, he said. Indeed, said Kravitz, although I could see he'd had his eye on Rosso from the moment he saw her. The maitre d' led us through the heavy curtain and down a narrow corridor to a service entrance which led to the alley behind the hotel. Right down there, he motioned toward a warmly lit doorway about 30 yards distant, and we started walking. Watch your step back here, Rosso said. The rats in these alleys will swallow you whole. Tripping in her heels a little bit, Kravitz took Rosso's elbow in his left hand and slid his arm around her back. I have you, Ginger, he said, obediently looking down at every footfall to avoid the puddles and the garbage. Yes, you do, she said. Dipping in his direction, she brushed her high-priced breast against him, letting Kravitz take in a deep breath of her Borghese. Ahead of us, 3 dark figures entered the alley carrying machetes. The IBMers looked back, but the maitre d' was gone. The door was closed. The three men walked toward us, raising their weapons. They demanded nothing. Their intent seemed clear. It was our engineers, and I was on. I ran toward them and hoped to God I didn't damage my dental work. When I got close, I could see Wong's face, and his fake blow missed me by a foot. I wrapped him up like a linebacker and took Wong down, feeling badly about how hard we hit the ground. I mean, we both had to work tomorrow. I didn't want to hurt the guy. I pulled a punch to his jaw when behind me I heard a firecracker go off, and then another. I wrestled with Wong for a few seconds when one of Rosso's Jimmy Choos stepped next to my head, and we both looked up to see her pointing a small black pistol at Wong. In the beat of a heart, I watched her put a bullet in his right eye. He slumped back to the ground, and I jumped to my feet, covered in sweat, shaking, and saw all three of our engineers sprawled dead. I puked my guts up. "Go," she barked at the IBMers. "Get your asses down there and let me clean this up." "Ginger," stammered Kravitz, I don't know what to say. You saved our lives." She threw an icy look my way, and I felt like I might pass out. "Martin," she said to me softly, "take them to the party, now." "We won't forget this, Ginger," said Kravitz. "I know you won't," she answered. I thought about my kids in their private schools, about the Beamers and the islands. Rotho smoothed her skirt and carefully stepped her way back toward the service entrance to the hotel where the maitre d' was waiting, and I took them to the party.
Sarah Weinman is the editor of Troubled Daughters, Twisted Wives, and news editor for Publishers Marketplace. Her nonfiction has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Nation, and elsewhere, and her fiction in Ellery Queen's, Alfred Hitchcock's mystery magazines. Her current project is a 2-volume set of mid-century crime novels by American women for the Library of America. And Sarah was also part of that original Noir at the Bar group in 2008. So please welcome one of the real founding mothers of Noir at the Bar.
Not sure what to make of being called a founding mother when I'm single and childless, but I'll go with that. Anyway, I'm going to read from a story that was in Needle magazine a little over a year ago, which I wrote a little bit before then, but I've never read it publicly, and it's called No Name Necessary. You don't need to know my name. It's not important. And I'll be changing it in about a month or two when I move on to the next city, just like I have 6 or 7 times before each time I arrive somewhere new. But I also know that being nameless doesn't really cut it for storytelling purposes. Even if I also told you that I'll be dead in a few years, my body dumped off the side of the road in the middle of nowhere for some vultures to feast on, or a curious dog to smell while out for a walk with its owner, and that once I'm found, my real name will be buried along with my corpse, never to be exhumed. How do I know all this, you wonder? I'm not psychic, gifted with some approximation of second sight, X-ray vision, or some unexplainable phenomenon. I just know my odds, and I have a good sense of my life's trajectory, living in squats, working menial jobs, and occasionally fucking for food doesn't add up to a long lifespan. I'd suggest trying it sometime, but some things shouldn't be learned firsthand without a sense of desperation. I could explain, but you don't want to know. Trust me. Besides, I'm not the star of the story, only the narrator, stuck on the sidelines to watch what happens next, without any chance of affecting its outcome, so that by the time I move on to my next port of call, I've added the burden of guilt to the small bag of possessions I carry with me wherever I go. Not even a new name can erase it. Because, you see, this story is about a girl not so different from me, working the same kind of shit job, a grimace permanently plastered on her face, with hands withered and wrinkled from endless dishwashing and clothes scrubbing and floor cleaning. A girl who traveled the same highways, added and subtracted aliases, serviced the same truck stops and many of the same men, and ended up, at least for a little while, thinking she might be able to find salvation in a beach town where the sun and surf and salt might cleanse her of past sins and entrenched horrors. The only difference is that she died and I didn't. When I knew her, she called herself Mary. Like the Virgin, she said, thinking she was being ironic when she only sounded self-important. You expected me to like her? That was difficult considering our introduction happened in the hotel bathroom, me coming out of the stall to see her snorting a line of coke off the sink. I wasn't against coke, but I tried to restrict my use to my own room and made damn sure to clean up the mess after. Mary never bothered to hide her habit, no matter how many times I caught her. She talked herself into a job as a washerwoman, and even now, I'm still not sure. The manager constantly barked orders, and Mary wasn't very good at keeping her mouth shut. The arguments they had were so loud I could hear them 3 floors up as I cleaned rooms, fluffing pillows in perfect sync with the rhythm of their shouts. The one time I complained, I benefited from a double dose of withering glares. It just wasn't worth it. Despite her flaws, Mary was an exceptionally good listener, uncanny in how she could extract confidences from people and never repeat them to anyone. At least she never did with me. I might not have liked her, but I knew what she was, a survivor. Those bottomless eyes of hers betrayed layers of hurt and pain that made it difficult to stare into for prolonged periods of time. Yet perversely they allowed me to do just that. She didn't have to say, "I understand," or "it's okay," or any of the other platitudes normally offered up. She just listened. That made her special. That made her rare. And that's what got her into trouble. It looked like suicide at first. Pablo, the hotel janitor, found Mary slumped over a bathroom stall at 5 o'clock in the morning, needle still in her arm. The manager tended to sleep in late, so he was ready to send her body wherever it was supposed to be processed, when asked to take a look a couple of hours later. The cops weren't called, lest they start sniffing around for any excuse to round all of us up on charges both bogus and vaguely true. I wouldn't have known if I hadn't woken up a half hour later with a burning urge to pee, an unwanted gift from the tattooed trucker I fucked in his paddy wagon a week earlier. The urge disappeared when I saw Pablo's face. "Mary's dead," he said, pointing to her body. That's kind of obvious. The skin on her back was blue, but her face was half red. I'd only seen 2 dead bodies before, but only one, my father, looked like this. Based on what I was told then, I figured Mary died around midnight. I brushed the thought away in case it brought back more unwelcome memories. Pablo crouched down, moving his hand underneath Mary's pants. "The fuck are you doing?" I tried to push him away, but Pablo's grip on Mary was too firm. "You like them dead, is that it?" His face paled, and he brought his hand back up. A plastic bag lay in his palm. "Oh, for fuck's sake," I said. I grabbed the baggie and threw it down the toilet, flushing it. "Mary's barely cold and you're looking to score. She's been dead for hours. How do you know that?" I put my hands on my hips. The stare down lasted until an unholy gleam formed in his eyes. "Same way you do, Bruja. You're not suggesting just like you weren't?" I dropped my hands. Pablo might have liked the white powder, but at 5'5" and 120, he wasn't much of a threat. Or a liar. His shock was genuine, both about Mary's death and my insinuation. "Truce?" I extended my hand. Not far enough for him to clasp, but to make the point of a peace offering. Pablo nodded. "I was worried about her. I should have worried more." "So you are one of them," I thought. That explained the recent spring in his step. "You should worry," I said. "Her dying will stink up the place, make people start asking questions. Why? She killed herself." It was my turn to crouch down, taking care to avoid Mary's death mask. I squinted at the back of her head. Scanning downward to her neck, I found what I was looking for. "How do you explain this?" I pointed to 3 deep red marks. "Mary was capable of strangling herself too?" Thank you very much.
Dennis Tafoya is another one of the original Noir at the Barnecks, and I'd like to ask him 5 questions before we start. He's the author of 3 novels, Dope Thief, The Wolves of Fairmount Park, and The Poor Boy's Game, and his short stories have appeared in places including Philadelphia Noir and Best American Mystery Stories, where I think your story was the first in the collection.
No, that was the good apple.
Well, never mind. Here's somebody who's going to pretend to be Dennis Tafoya.
I'm going to read a story that was in the same issue of Needle that Sarah's fantastic story was. It's called Satan's Kingdom. LaRoque got a call when his father died. This was when he was living in the desert in a trailer on the edge of Banning. He couldn't remember giving out the number, but one day in December the phone rang, and it was his father's girlfriend, telling him that Henry had died of cancer. She said he had to come decide what to do about the property, the dogs. She was moving to Florida, to Delray. After he hung up the phone, LaRoque put a hand on his chest, feeling a tightness there, as if he had called to tell him about a bill he owed. He stood for a long time in the open door of the trailer, feeling the heat, watching the trucks go by on 10. After a while, he began to carry his few possessions to the truck. The fan, the microwave with the taped door. He left a pile of things in the middle of the floor with a note for Jed and Marie, thanking them for the use of the place and saying they should sell what they could. They were gone, visiting Jed's son in Kanab, and the two Mexican kids whose names he had never learned were working the station, so he just stood at the edge of the broken asphalt, thinking about the difference between this place and Cheshire County. Here, the bright yellow and red of the desert was everywhere, even when you closed your eyes, even in a dream. He remembered New Hampshire as a wilderness of dark blue and black, so that even at noon it seemed like twilight, and it was hard to feel that what was happening was real. He had liked the trailer, this descending shelf of brown dust that led to the highway, the heat that he felt held him hard against the ground. Around the lot were scattered desert plants that gave off bright medicinal smells. Marie said that each one could cure a specific disease, and was always pushing some tea at LaRoque that she said would clear up his cough or stop his nightmares. She made sweet, grainy cookies and bread from mesquite and sold them from a little display Jed built in front of the station to the families on their way to Palm Springs, or Marines from 29 Palms. The young Marines were quick and lithe and seemed to LaRoque tense with the coiled and watchful energy of people capable of great violence. He wondered what he looked like to those travelers, and would take pains to smile at everyone, especially the cars full of young girls heading to weekends in the desert, to parties he'd imagined in night-lit casinos he'd never seen, except on television. Jed said he liked knowing LaRoque was there by the station after hours in case something happened, though nothing ever did. Days he worked landscape for Bermudez Triangle, and after dark he sat out at the highway. And after dark he sat looking out at the highway through the trailer's open door as if from a cave and sipping Whitehorse. On his last night, he watched a truck burning out on the highway, the police and fire trucks going by in showers of red light, and he realized that all the years he'd been in the California desert, he'd been hiding. It took him 4 days to get home. He stopped at a motel in Joplin off 44 and slept one night in a bed. He got breakfast in a diner and pulled a heavy coat off the rack as he was leaving. He was running out of money, wondered how fast he could sell the property, the furniture. His father had guns that would be worth something, a Lefevre 10-gauge with a Damascus barrel, a pre-war Marlin. He had kept them locked up against LaRoque, and his friends would make a show of slapping the big padlock on the gun safe with an open hand to make it rattle. He'd been running with Guilford Pelletier then, and would pass through his father's house at dawn, stinking of hash oil and beer after being out all night on the roads between Keene and Manchester. He'd been big early, LaRoque, wide in the shoulders and more than 6 feet at 15. The old man would loom over him at the table, jerk back his arm as if to hit him with the open hand that had dogged him since he was small. LaRoque would cut his initials into the soft, pale underside of the coffee table, or throw pine cones at the blue heelers Henry had been raising then. The old man feints made him flinch for a while, and then one day they didn't. He and Gifford stole the sign from the park called Satan's Kingdom across the border in Northfield, and LaRoque hung it in his room and waited for his father to say something. By then, the old man was ignoring him, other than to snort like an animal at a watering hole, when LaRoque high-stepped through the living room with a drunk's exaggerated care at 3 a.m, his eyes red as coals. The knowledge that he was beyond his father's control had made him feel weightless, almost nauseous, the way he thought an astronaut loosed from gravity must feel. That was one of his nightmares, flying away from the earth, the sky turning from deep blue to black at the edge of the void. Lying in the back seat of Le Mans in the parking lot of a Denny's just west of Wheeling, he remembered being 16 and driving all night, him and Gifford making wider and wider circles, 202 south to 119, west to 10, Fitzwilliam to Richmond to Winchester and up to Marlborough in the dark, and a hard white rime on the windows that shed flakes of frost onto their shoulders. Pelletier had an Italian pistol not much bigger than a pack of cigarettes, and he'd take it out of the glove compartment and stick it in his belt. They'd walk through gas stations and Dunkin' Donuts in the early hours, the Mr. Mike's on 202, Pelletier sticking candy in LaRoque's pockets and flashing him the butt of the little .32, watching for the cameras. They'd try the locks on the doors of the bank in Joffrey, the metal shop in Keene that somebody said processed gold. Pelletier would read him stories from the Union leader about robberies in Boston, a double murder in Etna. Pelletier would put a CD in some garage band he'd heard in Manchester, and they'd watch a young girl through the windows of a convenience store, her Wildcats hoodie riding up on her slim hips when she reached to get a pack of Marlboros. They had been trying to think of themselves a certain way. They had been working up to something.
That was Noir at the Bar, Philadelphia, recorded live on October 29th, 2014. You can find links to all of the authors featured on this episode and more in the show notes on my website, ericarneson.com. That's ERIKARNESON.com. Every episode of the Title 18 Word Crimes podcast is archived there at ericarneson.com. I'm also at Eric Arneson on Twitter and easy to find on Facebook. That's all for this episode of Title 18 Word Crimes. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. We have one more episode coming from Noir at the Bar in Philadelphia, which includes readings by Dwayne Swarzynski and John McGoran. Plus, my partner in Word Crimes, Scott Detro, returns soon to read short stories from some incredible writers. The music on this episode is by The Throws. You can find them at The Throws, THROES, thethrows.com. Thanks again for listening to Title 18 Word Crimes. We'll be back soon.